I got to a point where I finished the course and I had opportunities to have native, conversations with native speakers. And I experienced exactly what you just did. Like, oh, they didn't say what the instructor was going to say. So I think having more nuance and a bigger emphasis on comprehension is absolutely crucial.
So today I have a special guest. His name is Jon Hamilton. He is a member of the Green Berets, which is in the American military, their sort of special forces division. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And he has an interest in languages. He's been a follower of my YouTube channel, a user of Link. Has his own existence on the internet. And maybe I should just turn it over to you, Jon, to introduce yourself and the various activities that you have both, online and otherwise.
Yeah, first off, thanks again for having me on. Like you said, I've been a avid watcher of the YouTube channel and user of Link for almost 10 years now. So that I've been watching you. So quite a while. And I'm a former Green Beret. So I got out of the Army a couple years ago. That's our special forces where we work with other nations and primarily conduct what's called unconventional warfare. That has always been kind of a path that I wanted to go down because of the language requirement. It's one of the few special operations organizations that requires its members to learn a language, and we can get into kind of what level we learn it to and why that is. So yeah, it was a great opportunity for me to get kind of that introductory school to go through it, kind of where I got my dip my toe in the water with language learning, and then it's been a passion for mine ever since.
Interesting. And I gather too, you have a program or something to do with physical fitness that you do online.
Yeah, so that's called Infinite Grit, and we primarily were a team of got myself and two other Green Berets who I was on a team with, and we help future members or candidates train for and attend Special Forces Assessment and Selection, which is a pretty physically rigorous environment. I always push a lot of the guys to focus on not only the physical development, but a lot of the mental aspect. And with that is language learning, because I think there's a lot of crossover and discipline that is developed from learning languages.
To me, all of this is very interesting for a variety of reasons. First of all, when I was in the Canadian government in 1968 and I was selected to learn Mandarin Chinese, I had a choice. Either go to the Monterey, Defense Language Institute, or go to Hong Kong. And of course, Hong Kong, neither place was a Mandarin speaking environment. But culturally, of course, Hong Kong is closer to it is Chinese culture. And I chose to go there. And we can compare notes as to maybe the kinds of methods that are used at the Defense Language Institute versus what I did. However, the other thing is, I think when it comes to physical fitness, or language learning, we all have a tremendous, potential, which to a large extent depends on ourselves. Like we can become physically fit. We can become very physically fit. We can learn languages. If we have the right attitude, if we have a certain level of discipline, we can achieve a lot. So, and I also feel that staying physically fit helps me learn languages. I feel better when I'm physically fit. I'm not training to be a, a special forces person, but just even a little bit physically fit, I think gives you a more positive outlook and makes you more likely to succeed in another area of activity like language learning. So I just wondering, to what extent do you see a connection between staying physically fit and learning languages?
Hugely. For me, absolutely. Just speaking on my own experience, there's times where you're going to be more diligent, more motivated, more disciplined, and see a lot of progress. And for me, typically when I'm seeing the most progress with my language learning, it's also when I'm most consistent with training and eating well and taking care of my body. So I think both from, as like a physiological level of the cognitive function and the cognitive benefits we get from physical activity and fueling properly and things like that, but even a psychological level of like when we are kind of have that momentum built and we're in a groove of demonstrating a high level of discipline or doing the things that we set out to do on a daily basis, I think we're more consistent. And obviously, the consistency aspect is huge, both for fitness and for language learning. So, in my experience, they absolutely coincide.
And the sort of minor victories that we get if we can lift a little more weight, which isn't very much in my case, or, do a few more chin-ups. And when we were able to understand something we didn't understand before, all these little victories give us a real rush, a sense of achievement, and encourage us to keep going. So to that extent, I've always felt the two were related. So now the Green Berets, obviously there's a need in the diplomatic service and the military service and the special forces operation to have language skills because you are dealing with people of a different language, a different culture. So my question is how different was the training that you received in this sort of Green Beret approach to language learning versus what they do at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, and then I can talk to you a little bit about my experience learning Chinese in Hong Kong.
Probably with what I went through, which is a course, it's a 6-month course dedicated to those in special operations. There's still opportunities to go to Monterey, but it's primarily part of the Special Forces qualification course, what's called Civil Affairs, Psychological Operations, and other organizations like that. And the big difference with what we went through is a lot more focus on speaking. Whereas Monterey, you take a test called the DLPT,
Hmm.
and that is listening and comprehension. There's no speaking associated with it. The test that we take and the one that we had to, maintain currency on throughout our time in special forces is called the OPI, or oral proficiency interview, and it's strictly a conversation with a native speaker or tester of that target language. And then depending on how you do, you get into more complex areas of the conversation, political, even kind of opinion based, and that's how they grade you. So it's a little bit more subjective than fill in the blank or multiple choice questions, but a lot more focus on speaking. So whereas in Monterey, and I've had friends go through Monterey and know quite a few guys that have done it, huge emphasis on comprehension, on reading, on grammar. They spend a lot more time on grammar than we did.
Hmm.
And then whereas on our side, we got a little bit of grammar, but we dive into a lot of different topics, primarily associated with what we're doing. And then they focus, I didn't know it at the time, but heavily on sentence mining. So because
Who are they?
the instructors,
Oh, the instructors.
yeah,
I have a couple of questions. Which language did you study?
Russian.
Russian. Okay. The second question is, sometimes people may think that military or Green Beret that they're going to learn the language to a level where they can be mistaken for a native and be a spy. And of course, that's not the case. You need the language to communicate. People aren't necessarily going to mistake you for a native. Or am I wrong?
No, 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 you're absolutely correct. And the big reason why Green Berets learn another language is the Special Forces Regiment was originally created to insert behind enemy lines and train with and work through a resistance force. So start
Right.
working with the local population and develop relationships and things like that. So in that sense, a language skill or the ability to convey information was very important, but not necessarily like I'm gonna go to Russia and blend in. Like that's never gonna happen. So
Like the Russians, where they send someone there for 10 years and then he surfaces. No. So that's important to remember. In other words, if you can communicate and get people to like you will probably achieve your objectives. You don't have to be a spy, sort of thing. The second question I have is they focus on speaking, but if you don't have a certain level of comprehension, how can you speak? Like, how do you get to speaking?
No, I agree. I was very thankful for the opportunity to go through the course. I've
Right.
never had a time where I could just learn a language for 6 months. It was fantastic.
Mm.
But kind of learning what I have over the years that I've spent, immersed in this environment, there are some critiques that I would give. I think that there should be a bigger emphasis on comprehension, and that's something that I've learned through you and over the years of kind of being immersed in this environment of the value to it. And a lot of times they can be so focused on the test that they almost focus on scripting or sentence mining, kind of pre figuring out what you're going to say when you're prompted with different questions, which is effective to pass a test. But as far as using the language in an environment where you're speaking with native speakers, there's obvious limitations that that creates. So I think there should be a bigger emphasis on comprehension, almost more like what you'll experience out of Monterey.
Yeah, again, I didn't do Monterey, but when I think back to my course at Hong Kong, so the first 2, 3 months we were exposed to this, and it was Mandarin in my case, to this called I can't remember what it was, but Chinese dialogue or something, and they were speaking very fast. So the whole focus was on trying to understand the sound before we even attempted to learn characters. We were breaking through this sort of lack of familiarity with the sounds and the intonation and the rhythm of Chinese, and I thought that was very helpful. A major exposure to just the sounds, even if you don't understand it. To my mind, that worked. I now know through research that I've done that when we understand something, because the brain is forming connections, patterns, recognizing patterns, it starts to predict what's going to come. And whether it be vocabulary or endings or structures or tenses, it starts to predict, which is very important to our ability to understand. And it turns out that when we go to speak, we plan what we're going to say based on what we are able to predict. It's very interesting. There's lots of research on the web. Developing the ability to predict is important not only for comprehension, but also for the ability to produce the language. And without a sufficient amount of exposure to the language, in Canada, they have this thing called, if you're going to be a store clerk, you'll need to know this. Well, it doesn't work that way, because if you are a store clerk, you have no idea what people are going to say to you. And even if you are trained, as you say, with certain lines, and you can answer those lines when you are asked certain things in isolation, in the real world, it doesn't quite work so smoothly.
Absolutely, and I think in my experience, even in that environment, after spending 6 months and I was very motivated, I still am motivated to learn the language. I got to a point where I finished the course and I had opportunities to have native, conversations with native speakers, and I experienced exactly what you just did. Like, oh, they didn't say what the instructor was going to say. So I think having more nuance and a bigger emphasis on comprehension is absolutely crucial.
And I think you mentioned too the culture. I think when I was learning Chinese, the whole romance of getting to know Chinese history, Chinese culture, that's a big part of your learning experience. So it's as much a matter of what you can bring into you as what you can actually produce.
Yeah.
But that forms a basis for you then subsequently to be able to produce the language. And I guess they do more of that at Monterey and the Defense Language Institute.
Yeah, they kind of leave it up to the instructors that we had. Luckily, my instructor did push and talk about culture quite a bit, which for me got me more motivated, had more buy-in. I understand the people on the other side of the world, so it has more depth to it. So luckily, I did have that experience and kind of the introduction to the culture, but there's a lot of times where just check the block, like here's a language, you either get it or you don't. So it really kind of just depends on who your instructor is, but having that cultural development, I think, and from like a not even a learning languages in special forces, but just learning languages in general. That's what I've experienced is I'm most successful with languages when I have a genuine interest in not only the language and the sounds, but the culture and understanding who they are.
So that brings me to another point of similarity between physical training and language training. So obviously, if there's a pull factor, you're attracted to the culture, or it might even be a relative or a friend or whatever. That's the pull factor. However, in physical training, you have to push yourself to whatever it might be, that you're doing. You got to push. And certainly when I was learning Mandarin, I felt that the greater my intensity in learning the language, in other words, if I could do more in less time, I actually would generate some white heat of learning that was more effective than that same degree of learning over a longer period of time. And obviously in physical training, the more intensely you can train, the better the results. But it may not be because you're interested in the culture of, training or something. So how about the discipline side of things? Where do you see some similarities there between physical training and language learning?
I think in physical training, it's important to constantly have a goal that you're working towards. I think where a lot of people kind of fizzle out on the physical training side and likely in language learning as well, is they don't have a desired end state. Like they're not going on a trip to that country, or they're not competing or pushing themselves to go on a hike or go to the backcountry or do something like that. But when you have a tangible thing that you're striving for, even if it's just a 5-day vacation to Mexico and you want to be able to use Spanish, I think for me, that is where I get a lot of my motivation from to continue doing it on a daily basis. And it's true whenever it's, that law of things in motion tend to stay in motion, which is when we put a lot of effort into the gym and we have that positive feedback of, wow, I feel a little bit better today. I can, I feel a little tighter, a little stronger. I feel more energized. I think that positive feedback loop leads to more motivation and the likelihood of us continuing to do it.
What was that sentence again? Things that are put in motion stay in motion? Is that what?
Yes, things in motion tend to stay in motion.
That's absolutely true. Also, what is true is that, for example, my trip to Turkey or Czech Republic, if you have that kind of a goal in front of you, obviously that's going to be, a goal that's going to drive you. But many people don't have that. So how do you maintain the discipline when you aren't planning to go to Mexico, for example?
Personally, I think every individual is a little bit different. But for me, I don't want all of the work and time that I've put into my Russian, for example, or Spanish. I don't want that to go to waste.
Right.
So a lot of my motivation is almost a deterrence of loss now, right? I think at different points in kind of the journey, you'll have different levels of motivation. Sometimes when I was going through the course, my level of motivation was to be number one in the class, right? And it was more of a competitive aspect to it. But I think now it's that I've put so much work into it. I've spent so many hours of my life. I've immersed myself in it that I don't want that to go to waste. We have a lot of younger guys who are getting into language learning for the first time, and they'll pick up, the gamified apps and things like that. I often recommend Link because you're working a little bit more and it's not a game. And I think when you put in that effort, you get to a point where you realize how much work and time you've put into it, and it's harder to just let that go, as opposed to, "Oh, I was just playing a game. It's not a big deal if I stop." It's like, I've put a lot of effort into this.
I agree 100%. And even going to the gym, your long-term goal might be a little vague. I want to be more fit. Some people may have very specific goals. I want to, bench press, whatever. But every time that I go to a gym, or in my case, I don't go to the gym, I have my kettlebells or whatever, you feel good when you do that. So it's the sort of small victory. And similarly, when I'm a little demotivated, I don't want to work on my languages, but I overcome that, and then I spend some time with the language, reading something. Just the fact that I did that gives me a bit of a kick, a sense of achievement. I pushed back against something that was resisting me. And I think a lot of the sort of short term, small victories can be very, very important, as well as this, obviously the longer term goals. I'm sure this works in both physical fitness and language learning.
Yeah, hugely. I always say there's been plenty of times where I did not feel like going to the gym or going for a run or doing any of that stuff, but there's never been a time after I went to the gym where I regretted doing it. And
Very good point.
it's the same thing with language learning. There's been so many times where, I didn't want to sit down and read, or, preferred to listen to music while driving instead of the podcast. But at the end of what I'm doing, I've never regretted putting in that work or taking the extra second to go through it.
And you mentioned Duolingo and gamification. I'm not a big fan of gamification, but obviously many people do like learning that way. However, if I begin with a new language and I'm listening to content, I'm starting to understand it, that is the reward. Trouble with Duolingo is it's gamified, it's basically disconnected sentences and phrases that have no meaning, and it remains that for a long, long time. Whereas in, say, the link approach, not only do I initially have these sort of mini stories that I use, but pretty soon I can listen to podcasts. I'm listening to a podcast in Persian about the issue of water in Iran. I mean, real stuff, or it can be history, or to me, yeah, stuff has to be meaningful. And if you're doing something meaningful, then you do have a sense of achievement. Hey, I'm accessing this interesting material in the language of the country. You have a sense of achievement. And so I think things being meaningful is important. And similarly, in weightlifting, you can't fool yourself by doing something that's very, very easy and think you're training. You obviously have to do something that is harder to do, harder than the last time, in order to achieve any results.
Absolutely. That's the only way you're going to continue to progress, is by having that progressive overload where you incrementally challenge yourself. I've tried all of the different apps. I've tried Duolingo, I've tried, Babbel, all of the different apps, and some of them are better than others. But I always had a lot of frustration. I've always been interested in language learning even before I went special forces, but I always had a lot of frustration because I would put that time in and I would go to have a conversation, and just like you said, it was broken speech. I couldn't really understand. I couldn't really put sentences together. And I didn't see a big leap in my language abilities until I started listening to podcasts. And one of the ways I made those podcasts comprehensible is importing the transcripts into Link and reading through them. So I think, just like you said, it has to be meaningful, but it also has to be like natural speech where there's filler words, there's different intonation, there's
Right.
Russians will mumble a little bit or cut off endings of a word. So I think that you have to get exposure to that. And if it's just this constant, like perfectly recorded one sentence at a time, it's going to be very, very hard to get to the point where you can understand, a whole segment and actually learn something from it.
It's interesting. I recently did an experiment with Notebook LM, which will create a dialogue based on whatever you put in there, a URL or a text or something. The quality of the sound, the sort of natural emotion that they have in that artificial dialogue is much better than most language textbooks, boring content read by some professional narrator. It's amazing the quality of that AI. And another question I was going to ask, obviously, if you are in the military, maybe not all the military, but if you're in the Green Berets, for example, special forces, you probably have a little more courage than the average person, maybe. Do you think it takes courage to expose yourself, like before you are totally comfortable in the language, to just use what you got, to go with what you got? Do you think some people are intimidated? Or how do you see the relationship there between sort of willingness to expose yourself to potentially ridicule, yet the need to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't really thought about it, but looking back on my experience, I think it's hit or miss. Sometimes guys will be, like myself, I was very motivated and I would put myself out there because I had understood the value of that. But I think a lot of times, even in that environment, we can kind of protect our ego a little bit. And you'll see a lot of guys hold themselves back from speaking up, raising their hand, or even when they're called upon, hesitate or give short, one phrase sentences. So I think that is still a challenge that is not, that is experienced inside of the special forces guys as well. They're not completely immune to feeling their ego in those environments. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah, and physical courage, let's say, is not the same as the courage, the willingness to expose yourself potentially to ridicule or being thought to be less intelligent than you think you are. All of the things that inhibit people from speaking. Uh,
Yeah, and that's not to cut you off, but that's probably one of the reasons why I've seen a lot of Green Berets kind of struggle with putting themselves out there when they're practicing their language skills is every other environment of their life, they're pretty good. Like if they're doing skills on the range or, learning other skills, going through the mountains, doing physically challenging things, like that's their area of expertise. But I think when they're in these other environments where it's physically challenging, where they're doing the skills, the hard skills that they have practiced for many years, and that's the stuff that they join to do primarily. Uh, when they get into an environment where they're going to, speak pretty poorly or perform pretty poorly, I think you can kind of protect your ego even more so because you're used to excelling in other environments. That is something that you'll see with those guys quite a bit. Not everybody, but quite a few of them will have that reluctance to speak and that hesitation out of the nervousness of looking like you don't know all the answers.
so what's the remedy there?
Fast to fail is what I like to say. So I'll be fast to fail. I'll get the embarrassment out of the way and hopefully, break the ice with who I'm speaking to. And in the first, 30 seconds, they're gonna know how good or poorly I speak the language. So might as well get it out of the way.
Do you think it's a persuasive argument to say that making mistakes is gonna help you learn? That, in fact, the whole process of learning is identifying things that you can't do so that you'll notice them a bit more and eventually you'll make fewer mistakes. But if you don't push yourself beyond your comfort level, you aren't going to improve. That is true, but does that help people overcome their inhibitions or shyness or whatever?
I think absolutely from like a purely learning standpoint, yes, you got to make mistakes. And one of the things I do is I'll listen to a podcast and I'll learn phrases or new words and I'll seek opportunities to use those. And it's
Mhm.
good when I use a mistake. And sometimes, I would be speaking to the teacher and I would use that phrase incorrectly. And then she would provide feedback and I would have a deeper understanding of what that means and how to use it. So absolutely beneficial in regards to, the learning standpoint of making mistakes, but I've also seen the other side of the coin where individuals in class would speak, they would make mistakes, and then they would kind of go down that like, oh, I'm just not going to speak anymore because I made so many mistakes that I'm just not getting it. So I think you have to have the acceptance that you're going to make mistakes and go into it with that mindset. Because if you go into it thinking you're going to be perfect right off the bat, and then you're discouraged when you find out that your pronunciation isn't great or you say, speak with grammar errors, then you're going to have a tough time.
And we shouldn't underestimate the power of input. So many occasions I've not spoken to my online tutor for 3, 4 weeks, but put a lot of effort into input. And then when I show up again for a lesson with my tutor, she's amazed at how much I have improved, even though we haven't spoken. So it's a bit again like going to the gym. There's so much you can do on your own to improve your level of fitness, so that when you're next in a football game or something, you're that much fitter and do better.
Yeah, and I honestly don't speak, like, have conversations that much anymore. Now it's just, areas of opportunity. Like if I see someone in the store and hear them speaking Russian, I might try to speak out, spark
Right.
up a conversation. But one of the things I do is listen to the podcast, and I also do a lot of shadowing. So
Mm,
when I'm in my truck driving to the gym or driving to work or whatever, I'll put the podcast on, and it's easier with a monologue, and
right.
then just try to copy everything they're saying, how they're saying it with the intonation, and I've found that to really help my pronunciation and my ability to speak when I do have conversations.
I think we have a lot of similar views. I don't do shadowing. I find I can do shadowing with very sort of simple material. Again, like the mini stories, anything more interesting, complicated, politics, whatever, I find it difficult to shadow. But many people do it. So, I mean, it's just not everyone has to study the same way. But what I gather is that if listening to you, if you have a combination of sort of internal motivation, in other words, discipline to push yourself to do things, which will generate a sense of achievement, combined with a interest in the culture, a combination of those things is going to take you a long way. Similar, maybe some similarities there between physical training and language learning. And so, what are your plans now going forward? So you're developing this community online, mainly oriented towards physical fitness. And does it have a name?
So it's infinite grit. Most of our guys are training for the Special Forces pipeline, and we primarily focus on the physical fitness, the nutrition side of the house. But
Right.
every week we do a live call and have kind of a bunch of resources, and that's when we'll do the mindset development, talk about language learning is a topic that comes up with guys going into the pipeline and
Right.
other areas of interest as well. So starts with fitness and then kind of self development overall.
Well, it's been great talking to you. I think both physical fitness and language learning are examples of self improvement that are real. Because there's lots of books out there about self improvement, how you can do anything you want to do and make a million, make a lot of money and all this kind of stuff. But physical fitness and language learning, in other words, physically developing your potential, mentally developing your potential ability to communicate with other cultures, all of those things I think are tremendously positive. And I think we are both quite positive people, and I think that's important.
I agree. Like I said, over the years of watching you and listening to you and learning from you in the language learning realm, there's a lot to be taken away from that. And I've embraced a lot of those philosophies with my own language learning, and I have seen a lot of positive benefits not only on the language side but on the self development side. So I think whether it's learning a language, learning an instrument, getting physically fit, doing something that has or requires you to demonstrate a delayed gratification
Mhm.
is going to have long-term effects and positive benefits overall.
Yeah, delayed gratification, pushing the boundaries of what you can be as an
Yeah,
individual, and which generally enables you to help other people as well.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, John, that's been very interesting. Thank you for doing this, and good luck with you and your infinite grit.
Thank you very much.